Welcome back to Cringe-Watching. If you missed the first episode, this is a series where I talk about different TV shows that I watched through the course of the pandemic, mainly due to not having a lot of time. So while I do like to watch good TV, I ended up watching a lot of not so great TV. Today, we're going to be talking about Tin Man. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is one of those stories that everybody seems to want to adapt, and that's not too surprising. The first book may be a little repetitive, but Baum and later Thompson developed an interesting and surprisingly deep world with characters that, despite their seeming superficiality, are actually quite complex. The works are also, for the most part, public domain, meaning it's free real estate for any writer that wants to give their own twist on the story. Heck, even I've made my own redesigns of a few characters. Sometimes this turns out great, like The Wiz. Sometimes this turns out lackluster, like most other times. But it is interesting to see different takes on familiar characters, and when a local channel aired an over a decade ago sci-fi miniseries adaptation of the story, I figured why not, I'll watch it. Tin Man was a 2007 three-part show produced for the Sci-Fi Channel, directed by Nick Willing. Willing has a thing for making semi-dark adaptations of otherworldly children's books, having made two Alice programs and a Peter Pan adaptation. I say semi-dark because while Tin Man certainly isn't for little kids, it's nowhere near as dark as some parts of the original books, which were for little kids. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Tin Man stars Zooey Deschanel as Dorothy, Alan Cumming, Neil McDonough, and Raul Trujillo play the stand-ins for the Scarecrow, Tin Woodman, and Cowardly Lion, respectively. Richard Dreyfuss plays the Wizard, and Kathleen Robertson plays the Wicked Witch. This is a very loose adaptation. While there is a Dorothy Gale, she's never referred to as such, and is instead called DG consistently. Her aunt and uncle are replaced with an immediate family. She has close ties to characters of Oz before entering it, and she's much more of a modern protagonist, complete with chosen one status and special abilities beyond being a quick-thinking farm girl. The stand-ins for her companions are far from familiar as well. Glitch, the Scarecrow, does not actually attempt to scare away crows, but rather is essentially a lobotomy patient and a former scientist punished for his disloyalty to the witch. Kane, who is at least referred to as a Tin Man, is a sheriff type, much more of a vigilante than anybody who would actually cut down wood. Ra, who resembles the MGM character more than the original literal lion, is a psychic empath who speaks in broken English. They do happen to all want to either have more intelligence, more empathy, or more courage, but other than that, that's really the most that they get to their original characters. Without getting into spoiler territory, most other characters follow suit. These characters are far more inspired by the originals than adapted from them. You likely couldn't watch this and not pick up on all of the references if you're familiar with the original, but you could trim those references back easily and end up with a pretty unrecognizable original story. Ostensibly, I've seen this miniseries described as a steampunk adaptation, but there are only a handful of set pieces that I would say feel more steampunk than the original, or the MGM movie for that matter. Rather, this is just a slightly more modern, biopunk world with comparisons to be made to real-world fascist and anti-fascist groups. The world is also a bit more centralized. There are no references to Winkies, Quadlings, or Gillikins, and Munchkins are replaced by a questionably coded and potentially racist group of freedom fighters. Any whimsical elements to the setting are subdued. The Yellow Brick Road is shoddy and unkept. Oz is apparently an acronym meaning outer zone. There are a few main cities, though primarily focus is set on Central City, which is a grungier version of Emerald City complete with a seedy underbelly and corrupt cops. Wild animals are for the most part less developed, though there are still flying monkeys and a monster that is based on the poppies for some reason, rather than being based off of any of the number of monsters that do exist in Oz. The technology, instead, is more developed, with vans and pocket dimensions, more modern guns, suspension chambers, and while the level of magic is not cut back at that expense, we do have a good mixture of tech and magic, rather than just mainly magic with some 1900s technology. If any of this sounds intriguing, the possibility for compelling storytelling is lost in the execution. While there is enough of a world here, much more focus is placed on DG's relationship with the witch, which was hardly an element in the original books. Still, that could be fine if these were two really dynamic characters. A rivalry can make for incredibly engaging entertainment. However, these two seldom feel like they are actually interested in their conversations with one another. It's worth acknowledging that the acting in this miniseries is not great, sadly. I have seen Deschanel give great performances before, but she just really does not have any conviction behind the vast majority of her lines, at least in my opinion. And unfortunately, if they wanted to go in that direction, it could work too. Deschanel has given great deadpan performances, like in Elf, and that type of energy could have really served the dirty and lifeless feel of this version of Oz. But she disappointingly neither goes full Snarker nor full Judy Garland. There were like 2 lines that I actually bought from her, and she was disappointed and sarcastic at that moment, but otherwise she behaves mostly like a wide-eyed child, just not actually being a child, and that doesn't allow her to pull off the delivery. They either should have rewritten her character to be a little more cynical given her circumstances and the world around her, or actually cast a child for the role, which would have made her a lot more empathetic. Dorothy is treated as a child both by her enemies and by the companions that she has around her, and perhaps it's because I am in my 20s myself, but I don't feel like they are actually treating her the way 20-year-olds are really treated. I think if you had a child in this role, not only would it make this relationship that she has with the people around her more reasonable, I also think that it would allow her to be both in awe and in fear of her surroundings in a more relatable way. However, the Dorothy that we get goes from one plot point to another, never really developing a character until about halfway through, and by that point, it's one-dimensional at best. Most of the other performances are similarly lifeless without being funny. I don't hold it against anybody because I know people like Callum Keith Rennie and Dreyfus can and have delivered phenomenal performances, but it feels like most of the cast is just here to cash a check. I hope that isn't too harsh, but I think a lot of it comes down to the directing. For example, reading a little bit about behind the scenes, Robertson was specifically trying to appear quiet and self-restrained, but instead it comes across as she is bored with this part. Exceptions exist, though. Neil McDonough and Alan Cumming both give phenomenal performances, and that's not really surprising given that both of their careers have often had lackluster projects where they have still delivered excellent work. This really does pick up the pace of the series. McDonough's Kane is certainly a Clint Eastwood type, but there's a reason this type of character is done so often, and McDonough does it incredibly well. Now, does it rely on sexist writing used to perpetuate stereotypes and toxically masculine views on grief and loss? Yes. Is it entertaining to watch? Also yes. The show fridges his wife right at the beginning, and that's horrible and not really forgivable, but the acting is at least powerful enough to keep you going, or at the very least give you something to watch rather than just stumble through. Alan Cumming's glitch is not too dissimilar to other characters Cumming has played before. Like Floop and Nightcrawler, at first what seems like a well-played goofy man actually has some deep pathos hiding underneath it all. And unlike Kane, Glitch's pain is not motivated by having a dead wife, so there's that. Blue Mankuma also does a great job with his role. It's kind of a walking spoiler, but the miniseries does well when it comes to sad men. Little else. But with that being said, here is where I will get into spoiler territory. The last mainish character I haven't mentioned is a walking spoiler. Anna Galvin plays the deposed Queen of Oz, a bit of a stand-in for Glinda, the Witch of the South, who also happens to be the mother of Azkadellia, the Wicked Witch. This itself isn't a bad idea. Various witches have been made relatives in other adaptations, and the 2 Wicked Witches were sisters in the first book. So this is an angle that can and has worked. However, the thing that I think made this flawed from the start is the added twist that not only is she Azkadellia's mother, she is also DG's. By making DG an amnesiac lost princess of Oz rather than a stranger, a lot of the relatability the audience can have with her character is taken away. Not only is she born to power, an already alienating trait, she isn't even too unfamiliar with the world in which she finds herself. For the first episode of the miniseries, she hardly seems fazed when coming across anything supernatural or otherworldly, and this unflappability only becomes stronger when she regains more memories. It's also damaging to her overall story. Like the original Dorothy, and especially the MGM version, DG starts out in Kansas, wishing she had a more glamorous or exciting life. We see she works both as a farmer and a waitress, neither of which skills end up coming up again, by the way, but she longs to find a greater purpose. While other Dorothys would develop over the course of their adventure to find that excitement is tied to danger, and there's nothing wrong with a peaceful, less stressful life, though helping others is worth the risk to avoid it, DG, from the beginning, wants to be more important and more exciting, and she gets exactly what she wanted. She finds out that whom she thought were her biological parents for roughly a decade were actually androids built to pretend to love her, and her reaction is basically one of, well, now what? She doesn't seem betrayed or hurt. After all, she didn't want that boring Kansas life anyways, and she hardly seems hurt that her parents weren't actually her parents. So when she decides to become the joint ruler of Oz, in the end, it's basically like the character has changed nothing aside from their social position and address. She isn't grounded in the real world enough for her to feel out of place, and so when she becomes the queen, or rather princess, it doesn't really mean anything because she hasn't really taken a step aside from how much power she has. Not every character needs a personal arc, admittedly. Sometimes the arcs can be interpersonal, and that is certainly what is attempted here. When DG discovers her sister is the evil ruler of Oz, while she does set out to depose her, she immediately begins seeing her sympathetically, wondering why she would choose to be evil. It is revealed in the last hour or so that her sister was actually possessed by a witch, meaning she's not responsible for her actions. However, given we have spent about 5 hours watching her torture, abduct, murder, and attempt genocide, this turn feels out of nowhere. Immediately, DG wants to drop all other plans in interest of freeing her, specifically because she couldn't prevent it in the first place. But there's no hesitation on behalf of the people she's abused and whose family she murdered. I get it. Technically, this character, Azkadellia, is innocent of the crimes somebody else used her body to commit. That would be horrifying. This isn't a fact well conveyed to us, though, and not even hinted upon until the end of the series, so her redemption feels unsatisfactory when in the span of 4 hours we see somebody eager to torture a child, and then see that same person walk away freely. Even had there been some trepidation on the behalf of DG's companions, this could have worked as DG having a personal crisis of conscience, one that she herself had to fix for herself. But no, as soon as she remembers she didn't prevent her sister's corruption, she blames everything on herself, including all of the horrible evil acts that her sister committed. And while her companions don't blame her, they drop their animosity for Azkadellia completely. These are the most forgiving people ever. As a result, we have an uninteresting main character spending 2/3 of the time trying to defeat an uninteresting main villain, only for the third act to force a redemption arc that is neither compelling nor satisfactory, while the other 3 main characters handle destroying the super weapon and keep quiet about the abusive redeemed villain, even though those 3 main characters are more interesting than the other 2. Genuinely, when I started writing that sentence, I was not thinking of the sequel trilogy, but if the shoe fits. Well, I might as well bring up the uncomfortable racial elements in this miniseries. Most of these major characters are played by white people, save 2. Now, again, having a lot of white people in a production is not something that is racist, but our exceptions are a Native American man playing a mystical, half-human, half-beast with mind-walking powers that speaks broken English, and a magical black man whose sole purpose is to either transform into a pet dog or teach the 2 white royal children his magical ways. If you couldn't hear it, these are a lot of stereotypes. Were these intentional? I lean towards saying no due to the seeming lack of any intent throughout the entire production, but whether intentional or not, having your only major black and indigenous characters be either servants or beast-like or both is not a great idea. Now I can talk about one positive thing. One twist that I found actually did kind of work for me was the reveal that this isn't supposed to be a retelling of the first book, but rather a far-in-the-future sequel with familiar motifs and archetypes. It's revealed that DG is actually a descendant of the original Dorothy Gale, and given that Ozma made her a princess, this kind of works. All of the discrepancies take a different meaning in the view that this is Oz's future, not a dark version of Oz. Is 100 years or so enough, given all of the differences? Not really, but it makes more sense than when an adaptation just throws in dreary elements in the interest of seeming adult, but ultimately coming off as immature. So, in the end, would I recommend this miniseries? Certainly not to everyone. But if you're like me and you enjoy seeing different creative people's takes on popular ideas and have some time to kill during the pandemic, this may be a fun enough diversion. Don't expect high art, but you can expect some pretty good standout performances, catchy music, Emmy-winning makeup, and some laughably bad line deliveries. If you've seen the show, what did you think of it? Did I do it justice when describing it, or did I step out of line somewhere? What do you think I should cover next? If you have anything to say, please comment below, and thank you for watching.